Why was Rex so incredibly obsessed with birds? And it has to do with his father. His father was an amateur ornithologist and a resident of New York City who was fascinated by Audubon's work. And the family story is that he had made an appointment to go see the great man when Audubon was in New York, and took a trip, which entailed quite a bit of aggravation in those days, to get, this was 1840s, to get to where Audubon was staying. When he reached Audubon's residence, he knocked on the door, and the servant answered, and he said, "Well, I have an appointment." And the servant said, "The great man is not seeing anybody." And so he said, "But I have an appointment. Why don't you ask? Because here's the sheet, here's the invitation. I have an appointment." And he looked, and the servant turned, asked something, and Audubon said, "No, I'm too busy." And through the doorway, Rex's father could see a dead bird hanging by a string, and Audubon at his easel painting the bird. And the door shut in his face, and his trip was to no avail. Now, the feeling in the family was that this snub irritated his father, but it angered Rex. And Rex resolved that he, when he grew up, was going to paint birds better than Audubon, and he was going to paint more of them. And he was going to paint every bird in North America, not a dead bird hanging from the ceiling, but a live bird in its natural habitat. And his life was consumed by that desire and fulfillment of that desire until his death, really. His father died, his father was an avid sportsman, and they went into Jamaica Bay, the area around New York City. They studied birds. They actually shot birds. If you've ever been to the FDR estate, you know that he shot birds and stuffed them, and so did Theodore Roosevelt. It was kind of the thing you did. You shot the bird, you stuffed it, and you kept a collection. Eventually, even after his father died when Rex was in his early teens, he continued that practice until his mother told him that there were absolutely no more birds to be allowed in his room because they were taking over the house. And eventually Rex decided that it was not the right thing to kill them and stuff them, but rather to try to capture them living by painting them, drawing them and painting them. At one point he was hiking in, I think it might have been Georgia, and it turned out that he was in the presence of Colonel Albert B. Breckinridge of the Confederate military, who was lonely, took him back to his rather large house and said, "You know, I only put the gun on you because I wanted somebody to talk to." And he spent several weeks there, and this man showed him where to find the ivory-billed woodpecker, which even then was very rare. And Rex was able to observe a pair of them at that point. Interspersed, what he would do would be to sketch and take copious field notes, and he had acute powers of observation. So he would write, notes to himself about the colors. He'd write notes about the habitat, and sketch, make field notes, and then he would send them back to Brooklyn. And after perhaps 2 years wandering around, mostly on foot, he would come back and he would start putting those into finished paintings. He actually made quite a good, not a good, but an adequate living playing the horses. That's how he supported himself in general. And it did also finance another trip to the West, because he knew he had to get to the West in order to see the birds that he could not see in the East, like the roadrunner, for example. Had enormous powers of observation. Most of us probably would not be able to sit still in a swamp or sit still along a deserted stretch of road through the desert just to hopefully see a roadrunner run by. But Rex did, and he was rewarded by things that would be incomprehensible now. He witnessed a roadrunner killing a rattlesnake. And his roadrunner painting, of course, is one of his most famous. At this point, he had a body of work, close to 400 paintings. He looked over his earlier work and was dissatisfied with it. One of his biggest problems was learning how to paint feathers. And he went to the Museum of Natural History and struck a deal with them, because they had and have at that every bird that they knew of in North America stuffed, and they have, or they have the skins. And the curator of the American Museum of Natural History told Rex that he could come anytime, and they gave him a little place. But the feathers, Rex figured out himself. He had always drawn the feathers and then put in the colors, and it wasn't working. And finally he said, wait a minute, maybe I'm doing it backwards. So he started with the washes of colors and then the feathers, and it worked. And he said, aha. However, he then looked at his 400 paintings, decided they weren't any good, and destroyed them all. His half-niece Marie was his staunch supporter, and actually his supporter in monetarily for many years while he was struggling. He had a lot of the people that he had known before really thought he was crazy. And he reached a very low point when the head of the Audubon Society, Roger Torrey Peterson, offered him a job to do the birds of North Carolina. And that was what allowed Rex to come to this neck of the woods, because he got $700 for it. And he and Marie had decided that he needed to get out of New York City. There was too much bustle, too many interruptions. It wasn't working for him. Excuse me. And so he wanted a place to come. And they found an advertisement for a farm, which supposedly was in Kent, but is really in New York State, just to be clear. And Rex came up, took a tour. The man wanted $1,000 for it. Rex said, I'll give you $700. The man said, done. And that was the end of it. And so he came to Chickadee Valley. Now he's in Kent, and he has a chance to paint, and he eventually finishes all 174 watercolors. This incredible, amazing, incomprehensible work was done. And now he's bored. What do you do now? You've done your life's work. What do you do now? So they came up with the idea of making the books, the 12-volume set, Birds and Trees of North America. This is one of the originals. I call them original prints, done by Rex. And he had the Meriden Gravure Company do the prints, but they weren't just black and white, they had shades of gray. And then he hired local people to do backgrounds, but he did the birds. And I understand that it was done by masking and essentially doing very intricate stencil cutouts of each of the prints, and then hand coloring each one using an airbrush. Incredibly meticulous and hard work. And the total number is about 90,000. The other thing about Rex is he traveled around the country and had all these adventures up until he was 40. No, he wasn't, life expectancy wasn't that long in those days, but he had the supreme confidence that yes, he was in good health, he would be able to do it, and he did. In fact, when he was 30, he signed on to a fishing boat for 2 years out of Boston because he wanted to be able to paint the ocean birds. I found a clipping, an old weathered newspaper clipping from the New York Herald Tribune, and I believe it was 1932 because it referenced Rex being 60 years old at that time. And it talked about how he had originally planned to do 500 sets. And then sanity prevailed, and he realized that that was just unrealistic, and they cut it down to 100. And according to this article, they had 95 subscribers, but then came the crash of 1929, and 60 of them backed out. But then eventually they were able to get enough so that they had 75. And that's according to the article how many they made. We don't know how many were made, nor do we know where they all are. The intact ones are mostly in university libraries. Others have been broken up, and prints like that are available for sale on the internet. There's some reputable dealers. I should explain that. The RBA was started, as we said, about 10 years ago. And we commissioned these digital copies of the original paintings that are at the Dodd Center in protective storage and have been since 1988. They had originally been exhibited at the Harkness Museum, but they were deteriorating because it wasn't climate controlled and so on, and so they were put in protective storage. The sale of the originals is also interesting. That was supposed to take place earlier than it did, but part of the deal was the state of Connecticut was supposed to build a museum. And if you go to Kent Falls, there's apparently still bricks there that were supposed to be used for this building that was to house all 874 paintings. But that did not happen. And Rex took them back, and then in 1941, in part due to the hard work of a committee headed by Walter Pape, who was the editor and publisher of the Waterbury American, the state of Connecticut decided to buy the original paintings and did so. And they were exhibited, but not until about the 50s, because World War II intervened. He had, unfortunately, uncannily bad timing, everything he did, it seemed, and they never built the building. And so, although, as I said, they were exhibited until 1988, they have not been seen except in small doses. I was asked before I started speaking, it is possible to see the originals, the original paintings, but you have to make an appointment with the curator of the Dodd Center, Melissa Waterworth Batt, who will bring out the ones you're interested in seeing. You can't see all 874, nor would you want to, but you have to make an appointment. They will bring them out and you can look at them. And there was once, to my knowledge, in the last 10 years, the only exhibit of any of the originals has been at the Mattituck when they did an exhibit about the Kent Art Colony and included 7 of Rex's originals. But this is as close to the original as you can get. Very high quality. Each one of these is probably $400 to $500 to make one print. Our goal is to get more sets made so that they can go to museums or libraries or schools. You know, these, yes, they're very valuable, but it's not like the originals, and they could be remade if something happened to them, because once you've got the original print, you've got it. So the next project is raptors. We're going to do 14 raptors and hopefully be able to get those out, because raptors are all throughout the United States. And although the state of Connecticut is due the greatest praise in the world for having preserved the paintings, Rex's art really belongs to the whole country and should be available everywhere, not just here.